What are the four most influential events that you can think of on the Bible timeline, on the man's history timeline? Well, I will tell you the four most influential events that I can think of, and albeit this is Jim Staley's opinion of what the four most important events are, but the four most important events, according to Jim Staley, are the following: the giving of the commandments in the garden, the giving of the commandments at Mount Sinai, the blessings and the curses, the birth of the Messiah, and the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. There are lots of different events that happen in human history, but these, in my opinion, are some of the most important events that ever happened. We are going to focus on the last two events, the birth of the Messiah and the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah, as those two drastically affected the future of mankind. So now let's travel back in time 4,000 years and begin to discover where the history of some of these traditions came from. We're going to find ourselves all the way back in the time of Noah. Matter of fact, let's begin in the old-fashioned way. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there lived a man named Nimrod. Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah. He was the most popular man on the earth at the time. Matter of fact, he was the king of the then-known world. He was responsible for building the cities of Babel and the Tower of Babel and the city of Nineveh, amongst others. Well, all that being aside, Nimrod, no doubt, had tremendous influence among the people that he was with. And what happened was he had this uncanny reputation of strength. He created great armies, and he was the ruler of the then-known world right after the flood. He was full of idolatry and covetousness, drunkenness, rebelliousness towards God. And he had a phenomenal ability to deceive. In fact, I suppose he was much like, an early politician 4,000 years ago. But Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis. Now, Semiramis and Nimrod became basically king and queen of the then-known world. Well, at some point, Nimrod dies, and he became deified. He was the very first person that was ever deified on planet Earth, and they made him the sun god, which ended up being Baal. The word Baal in your scriptures can be traced back to Nimrod, so it's an interesting reality of history. When you see Baal and Ashtaroth, you're ended up coming all the way back to this story of Nimrod and Semiramis. And so Baal is now ruling the universe as the sun god, and somehow luck has it, through the Babylonian legend, that Semiramis gets pregnant by the rays of the sun of her deceased husband, Nimrod. And she gives birth to a young baby boy named Tammuz. Now, further down in the story, as Tammuz grows and becomes a man, Tammuz actually marries his mother, and they have a very sexual relationship. And that baby Tammuz and his mother Semiramis is where you get the story of Cupid. Cupid, during Valentine's Day, is how the story of Valentine's Day developed, was from Tammuz, who married a very unbiblical relationship with his mother. Okay, back to the story of Tammuz. So Tammuz, for 40 years, was a tremendous hunter, and he took the place of his father, ruling the world, and had tremendous power. But more than anything, he was a credible hunter. But unfortunately, his gift and his skill of hunting caught up with him one day, because he was killed during his 40th year by a wild boar. And so what would happen is Semiramis, at some point after that, she died, and she was sent up into heaven, but apparently her deceased husband, Baal, was not ready for her. So he sent her back down into earth in a giant egg, and it exploded in the Euphrates River. And the very first thing that she did when she came out of that egg was she turned a bird into an egg-laying rabbit. That's right. As crazy as it sounds, that's where we get our egg-laying rabbit from. That's where we get the Easter bunny from. Now, before you go any further, you're thinking, well, an egg? This sounds like a fairy tale. Well, It's a Babylonian legend. But you have to understand Eastern culture back then is that eggs were a tremendous symbol of fertility among many of the gods. They even believed that the earth was born out of a giant egg. So it's not surprising amongst the scholars that this legend would be that Semiramis would come back down in the form of an egg that would immediately tell the people of the earth that this is a god. It's in a goddess situation. It's a deity because there is an egg of fertility that's involved. And so what happens is you're going to see similarities now between the holiday of Easter and the traditions that we celebrate during Easter, and all of these traditions that date back 2, 3, and 4,000 years ago. So right off the bat, we discover that the Easter Bunny comes from that one act that Semiramis did when she broke out of the egg. Let's see if we can find some other traditions as we move along here. Now, every spring, the first Sunday after the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, they have what was called Ishtar's Sunday. And they would have a sunrise service. Now, this part of the legend is difficult to confirm because there's so many different versions. You can make up your own mind whether or not this particular part of the legend will be credited to you. But it is quite interesting how one particular part of the legend lines up so eerily with dying of Easter eggs. Because what they used to do in this part of the legend was that at the sunrise service, the priest of Ishtar would impregnate young virgins on the altar. And during that same service, they would take the babies that were now 3-month-old from the previous year, and they would sacrifice those children on the altar to Ishtar, and then they would take the eggs of Ishtar, and they would dip those eggs in the blood of those young infants. And that is where we get sunrise services, and that is potentially where we get the dying of Easter eggs. It is also interesting to note that worldwide universal color of Easter eggs is red. Even the White House, the official color of the White House Easter egg is ruby red. Now, back to Tammuz. Tammuz gets killed by a wild boar. So every year in commemoration of celebrating the death and the deification of Tammuz, which became the son of God, the son of his father, they would set aside 40 days prior to Easter, and they would fast and they would pray, and they would have a giant feast on Easter Sunday where they would celebrate the death and the resurrection of Tammuz. And guess what they would have for dinner on that Sunday evening? You got it, Easter ham. They would kill a boar in commemoration to Tammuz, who was killed by a wild boar. And yes, the 40 days prior to Easter, where we call it Lent, or the Catholics call it Lent, that 40 days did not come from, my friends, the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. That 40 days was already in place for thousands of years before Jesus even showed up. It comes from the 40 days of fasting and praying for Tammuz before they celebrated Easter. The 40 days of the fasting and praying of Jesus, and I like to call him by his Hebrew name, Yeshua, which means salvation. Yeshua's fasting and praying in the wilderness for 40 days is just a coincidence. Why? Because the Father knows the truth, and the enemy used to be the right-hand man of the Father. And he knows the prophecies. He knew exactly how everything was going to be laid out. So he developed all of these traditions of men and all of these legends, whether they be true or not true, but he developed them to skew our foresight and our ability to understand that when the truth would actually come, that we would not recognize it. He created a fraud, and we've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And so we begin to see some of these traditions. We discovered where Lent came from. We've discovered where Easter ham came from. We've discovered where the sunrise service came from. We've even discovered why we chose the first Sunday after the spring equinox. We didn't choose it. It's always been there on the celebration of Easter. Now, what's interesting about Easter and Baal, or Semiramis and Baal, is the names. We find these names all over Egyptian hieroglyphics, all these different, the Phoenician hieroglyphics, all these different artifacts from all over the world. And so I'm going to give you some of the names and what they're most commonly remembered for in these different cultures, and some of you will recognize them immediately. First of all, in Egypt, they were known as Isis and Osiris. In Phoenicia, they were recognized as Asheroth and Baal, the very same Asheroth and Baal that you see in the Scriptures. In Greece, they were Aphrodite and Adonis, or Eros, where we get the word erotic from. And in Rome, they were called Venus and Cupid. That's right, that's where we get Valentine's Day from, and Cupid. Even in the Far East, listen to this, this is amazing, Cupid was known as Zoroaster. Zoroaster is made up of two words, Zoro, which means seed of, and Asheroth, which is Easter. And so what Cupid actually means in the Far East is the seed of Easter, or the seed of his mother. Okay, and that's from the archives of the bookshelf, February 1994, Volume 2, Number 2. We've discovered Easter, Easter eggs, Easter ham, Lent, Cupid and Valentine's Day, where Easter Sunday is, and the sunrise services, and the like. Now we want to move into the Scriptures and show you some connections of these names, because you've read some of these Scriptures, and it is uncanny how Yahweh, God, always tries to speak to the Israelites and warn them to stay away from Ashtaroth and Baal. Let's read the Scriptures. Judges chapter 2 verse 13 says this, "And they forsook Yahweh and served Baal and Ashtaroth." 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 4 says, "Then the children of Israel did put away Baalim and Ashtaroth and served Yahweh only." And last but not least, in Romans chapter 11 verse 4 it says, "But what says the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal." Now what's really interesting is we are going to discover what that image of Baal is a little bit later in this program. Right about this time, you're probably having that thought that I warned you about hit your brain, saying, that's not what it means to me. I celebrate the birth of Jesus, and I put all the focus on Jesus, and I celebrate His resurrection, and I want to focus on Him. Well, your heart may be to want to focus on Him, and you absolutely may do that. But the truth of the matter is that it doesn't matter how much we focus, how sincere we are, and how pure our hearts are. It only matters that are we worshiping Him the way that He asks us to worship Him, and is anything that we're doing offending Him? Now, later on in the program, we're going to go through the Scriptures and see if there are any Scriptures talking about Christmas and Easter and any particular instructions allowing us to worship Him in whatever way that we want. But in the meantime, please keep an open mind as we move through the rest of this history and some of these symbols, which are very shocking, that you're going to find out how they moved through time and ended up in our Christian churches today.